If you look at the returns of the TSP F Fund, you'll notice that it's not really been performing very well lately. But that isn't entirely fair. Bonds have just gone through the worst performance period in the history of the markets, so we really have an anomaly. But why is the title of this video so harsh against the TSP F Fund? Well, that's because I have a fundamental challenge with bond funds in nature. One thing that many federal employees approaching retirement know is that they need to become more conservative with their portfolio the closer they are to retirement. And whether a TSP participant is holding the F Fund directly or indirectly through one of the TSP lifecycle funds, the reality is that the F Fund is a part of millions of portfolios. The theory is that you don't have time anymore to recover from a catastrophic decline of your portfolio, so you need to be more conservative. But which TSP funds can help you pump the brakes on market volatility? We know that the C Fund, S Fund, and I funds, those are all tools for growth, so those are out. So that basically leaves the G Fund and the F Fund. The G Fund is essentially a cash position because, well, look at how much it's paying compared to what you can earn in a money market. So it's probably not appropriate for a large part of your portfolio if you don't need to use all that money soon. The G Fund will lose purchasing power because inflation tends to outpace it. Well, that essentially leaves the F Fund, and for now, we're just going to exclude the mutual fund window choices in this video. I don't think the mutual fund window is quite where it needs to be for investors to use yet, but that's a video for another time. And to understand why the F Fund can be a challenging investment to use, you have to understand what the F Fund is designed to do. After speaking with thousands of Feds over the years, I can tell you that many people misunderstand how the F Fund is truly designed. The F Fund's investment objective is to match the performance of the Bloomberg US Aggregate Bond Index, a broad index representing the US bond market. Now, bonds can be a quite complicated investment. The way they operate is not quite as intuitive as a stock. If you want a stock investment like Apple or Verizon, or a stock index fund like the C Fund or the S&P 500, if the stock price goes up, so do your investments. Bonds, on the other hand, don't work quite the same way. In fact, the TSP has the following to say about the F Fund. F Fund investors are also exposed to the possibility that principal and interest payments will not be paid. By the way, this is also known as credit default risk, which they have on the website. Your F Fund investment is also exposed to prepayment risk, which is the probability that if interest rates fall, bonds that are represented in the index will be paid back early, thus forcing lenders to reinvest at lower rates. Obviously, there's a lot more going on here than a price just going up and down. When you purchase a bond when it's created, you pay the face value of the bond, let's say $1,000. And that bond has a maturity date. In this example, we'll say that that bond is maturing 12 months in the future. By purchasing the bond, you are essentially lending that money to the organization that sold you the bond, whether it's a corporation or a government, and they get to use that money and repay you an interest payment along the way during the time that the bond is invested. This is your incentive for lending your money to them. They pay you the interest while they get use of your money. And these interest payments come typically twice a year. So in this 12-month bond example, we would have probably 2 interest payments during the year. And in our example, let's assume that this interest payment on an annual basis is 6%. So you purchase a bond for $1,000, you're lending that money to an organization. Along the year, you're earning 6% interest, and then at the 12-month maturity, as long as the corporation or government didn't default on it, you're receiving your $1,000 back again. So you got your initial $1,000 back plus 6% interest during that year. Sounds pretty simple, right? But the language on the TSP's website sheds light to other complications that come with bonds. You see, bonds actually have an inverse relationship to interest rates. And here's what that means. If you were to picture a seesaw, where on the left side, you have the price of the bonds, and on the right side, you have interest rates. What would happen in this relationship if interest rates went up? Obviously, the other side of the seesaw would go down, which means the value of bonds would decrease. And this is exactly what's happened over the last year and a half. The Federal Reserve has been increasing interest rates, which means that new bonds that are being issued today or recently have paid more interest than bonds that existed in the past. This is just how you have to pay more for a car loan or for a mortgage today than you did a couple of years ago. So obviously that means that any older bonds that are paying less than the rates available today are just not going to be as valuable, because why would I want your bond that pays less when I can just go get a new one that pays me more? That's why their value goes down when interest rates go up. So back to our example, you paid $1,000 for a bond and it hasn't matured yet, but now you have to sell that bond because you need some cash. Well, if interest rates have risen, maybe they're paying more than the 6% bond that you have, so perhaps your value of the bond is now actually only $900. If you were to sell this investment for cash, then you're realizing a pretty big loss, even though this is a conservative type of investment. And this is true as time goes on. You might find that the value of the bond goes up and then goes back down, up, further up, down, up, down. It always goes back to par value, or the original purchase price at its maturity. That's one thing that's very unique about bonds that you should understand. Now, imagine a massive pool of these bonds, all different maturity dates, and you don't get to control any of the buys or the sells. And you also have millions of other investors also putting their own money into the same pool of bonds. There's bound to be people every single day that are asking for money from their accounts, and so the bond fund has to sell the investments to generate the cash and provide it to that investor, even if it means selling a bond at a loss. And fundamentally, this is how the F Fund or any other mutual fund of bonds is going to work. No single individual investor has control over if someone else needs their money today, and those sales could be negatively impacting the value of your shares. All right, so now that you have a foundation of how bonds work, let's talk about why bond funds like the F Fund can cause challenges in your portfolio. But before we do that, look right below this video. If you're not subscribed to this channel yet, now is your chance to do so. We have a lot of videos on the way, all designed to help you plan a better retirement, so make sure you subscribe so you can see them. Now let's cover some of the main challenges that bond funds create, and then after I'll show you one way that you might consider using bonds for your benefit to help you potentially avoid some of these problems. Bonds are still an incredibly important part of a portfolio, so make sure you catch that last part. The first challenge, like I mentioned, is this concept of intraday pricing. The daily market price goes up and down just like stocks, depending on what's going on in the bond markets. So a bond might be up in value, might be down, up, down, back to even again. But again, if you remember how bonds work, if you hold the bond all the way until maturity, you get your principal value back as long as it didn't default. So those price fluctuations may not be so much of an issue for you if you have that flexibility. Problem is, inside a bond fund, you don't get to have that flexibility because it's not up to you. Next, if the interest payment only gets paid twice a year, what do you think happens if a bond is sold out early? Well, the expected interest rate you thought you were going to earn, that's not really what you're earning anymore. And that's a shame, because the interest rate payments is one of the most valuable parts of owning a bond in a portfolio. That cash flow is part of what you need in your retirement so that those paychecks just keep coming to you as you live your life. If a bond was paying you 6%, but it was sold a third of the way through, what was your actual yield? Next, in a giant pile of all kinds of different bonds in the US bond market, which ones are the right ones for you? Remember, bonds are not like stocks where the only thing we care about is that they go up in value. So how can you address these challenges to better use bonds in your portfolio? If you are still working and contributing to the TSP, the F Fund does provide some reduced volatility, so that's one way that you can use this fund. You just have to consider the costs that we've discussed so far. But if instead you're able to use individual bonds instead of a bond fund, you're the one that is now in control of making the choices of when to buy, when to sell, and which bonds are going to be most beneficial for your position. Back to our $1,000 bond example, even if it reduces down to $800, you're still collecting those interest payments along the way, and as long as you can hold that bond to maturity, then you're likely to get that $1,000 again, and you'll have earned that interest payment along the way. And with this, you'd have other parts of your portfolio designed and set up to cover the cash needs that you might need in the interim if it goes above and beyond the interest payments that you're generating. This makes it so that you're not forced to sell the bond once it's at a discount, thereby making that loss permanent like it would be inside a bond fund. Now, imagine if you had a series of these bonds, all with differing maturity dates and different interest payments. This is something that's known as a bond ladder. Many of you may have heard of a CD ladder. Sometimes banks will offer these to people. And the concept is essentially the same. The only difference is that bonds have a lot more options, they're not bank products, and they're typically paying you better yields along the way. You can pick bonds that give you better yield, higher levels of safety, shorter duration, longer duration, whatever's most appropriate. And really, the idea is that you have control over designing that conservative bucket of your portfolio. And this total control gives you that certainty that you can continue to get your interest payments and not have to worry so much about the intraday price volatility that you would see in a bond fund. And this has been a very successful strategy for many people, especially those in retirement, because it's allowed them to continue to get those cash flows even when other parts of their portfolio aren't doing so well, like perhaps stocks, when the S&P is not doing well, or other things are happening. In retirement, you want to be able to still enjoy your life, like travel, meet your expenses, do what you want, regardless of what's happening in the markets. So you need to set up your portfolio in a way that can support you both in good markets and in bad markets. So bonds can be a very powerful tool, but only if they're used correctly. You should be careful that you're not using bonds with a very high spread or markups on any of the bonds you're buying yourself. And if you can, try to utilize an institutional trading desk who's likely going to get better bond pricing for you. So I hope this was helpful. Leave a thumbs up if you learned something, and until next time, stay wise and stay wealthy.